my lowest was dark. I'll never forget it. I remember never forget realizing how bad this is. I'm back to normal. They're words I never thought I'd say. As hard as it is to believe, I promise you there is an end. I promise you, as strange as this is normal. I look back literally where I was, where everyone may be right now, and listening to someone else tell me that it will be okay, and me going, I just don't see how, but I promise you, it will be okay.
Hey everyone, I'm Sean O'Connor, author of the Depersonalization Manual, and today I'm speaking with Adam Flame from Sydney, Australia. Adam is 30 years old. In 2022, he developed Depersonalization Disorder triggered by an intense panic attack. His symptoms included intense feelings of unreality, a sense of impending doom, an inability to go outside, and the fear that the condition would last forever. Adam suffered with the condition and these symptoms for about 2.5 years. But fortunately, Adam has since made a complete recovery. As he wrote to me in a recent email, quote, I can be a father for my kids at 100% capacity. I can go out and do things that I like now without discomfort. To be honest, I haven't even thought about DPDR in the last 8 months. I can't believe I would ever be able to say that. End quote. And Adam is with us today to talk about his experience with and recovery from Depersonalization Disorder. Adam, you're very welcome to the channel. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on the channel. Adam, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I can. My name is Adam, as you know, 30 years old. I live in Sydney, Australia. I'm a father of two. I work as an electrician. I'm also licensed as a roofer. I've been a blue collar pretty much ever since I left school. My hobbies include motorbikes, the gym, and pretty much video games. That's what I love to do in my spare time. As my traits, I would consider myself quite a casual, anxious person. Other than that, I'm quite a simple individual.
Super, super. And how old are your kids?
My eldest is 5 and my youngest is 2.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
How's fatherhood working out for you?
Fatherhood's a lot easier now. I can promise you that. But yeah, it's been absolutely sensational experience. So I wouldn't change anything for it. Wouldn't say I was ready for it, but it's yeah, it's amazing. I absolutely love being a father.
Great, great. I'm thrilled to hear it. So Adam, can you tell us a bit about what started things off for you in terms of depersonalization, derealization?
I can. I would have to start back in 2011, I believe it was. 17 at the time. I was a very outgoing person. I pretty much was everywhere but home. So I had a night planned out on a Saturday night, I believe it was. And basically, it was a rather large party that had been, sort of word of mouth for a while, and we were quite excited for it. The night before, one of my friends had stayed the night at mine, and it was quite a casual night. No one really thought anything special of it, but we ended up actually just staying up all night playing video games and just chatting, probably just excited for the following day. So that night I actually pulled my first all-nighter. Crazy. But the following morning, we hadn't slept and I was actually quite tired, and I started feeling some pretty fatigue traits, which was a little worrying because I was really excited for this party, and the last thing I wanted to do was be tired. But I pushed on. We had plans to meet the rest of our group at a local mall, which is sort of the center point for where we live. The buses kind of divert everywhere to that point. My girlfriend at the time was also working there, so we thought it would be a good spot for us all to meet before we went out to this, big raved up party. So we made our way down there. My friend and I were sitting there, just waiting for the rest to get there. This tiredness and regret from the night before of not sleeping really started to show. And I remember we were sitting there and I was just minding my own business, but I just stared at my friend for maybe a second or two, a little bit longer. And I had this really strange feeling of where my eye was focused on him, but everything around him just started blurring and feeling really almost like you're going through like a void, like you're seeing like starship movies and stuff like that. And that really was the first for me. I'd never really experienced visual disturbances, but so I was quite uncomfortable. And almost within seconds later, my heart started beating really aggressively through my chest. So with those two going on, I started to get quite panicky, and I'd actually put my fingers to my neck. I could feel it just pounding on my finger. And I said to my mate, I said to him, I'm not feeling too well. And he goes, "What do you mean?" And I grabbed his hand, I put it on my neck, and he looked at me. And the second he gave me that look is when I knew something wasn't right. And that was for the first time in my life I'd ever experienced an anxiety attack. And it was absolutely frightening. I just remember I lost all self-control of even my body. Just I was almost trying to grab for something that didn't exist. I was just in sheer panic. And my first thought was, I'll call my mum. And that was the first number I dialed in. I called my mum, frantic. And I feel so bad now looking back, just her picking up and she hears that. I've just said to her, I think I'm having a heart attack. I don't know what I don't know what to do. And then I said, maybe I'm going to collapse. I don't know. So bless her, she dropped everything. She drove down. She picked me up. She took me home. And, she was trying to calm me in the car and tell me it was all right. And she actually said, "You're having an anxiety attack." And I was like, what's anxiety? What's an anxiety attack? What does that mean? About 10 minutes later, we got home and I'd actually calmed down a lot. The attack itself had finished. But I remember she had like dim lamps around the house, just nothing on the ceiling. It was all just dim lamps. And I remember just that light setting, and I really noticed that my vision felt exactly how it did when I was looking at my mate, not even 15 minutes ago. So as much as I was calm, to an extent, I was also traumatized, but confused and lost. And then I had this consistent visual disturbance. And I thought, is this, what sleep deprivation is? Is this normal, basically? And I said to my mom, I said, I'm almost can't see straight. I don't know what to do. And short of the story, she actually organized to see a psychologist about 2 days after, which I think it landed on a Monday. But I said to myself, this is probably sleep deprivation. I'll go to bed, I'll wake up, and I'll see how I feel. I'd gone to sleep, I slept fine, and I'd woken up, and that feeling was there almost immediately. When I opened my eyes, things went real. And it felt so unreal that I actually got out of my bed and went up to my light switches, my door, my television. I had to touch them to try and tell myself, is this real? And it was just bizarre. And then I thought, am I crazy? Of course it's real. But fast forward, we went to the psychologist, and thankfully this was probably one of the blessings of this whole journey. Was she said to me, once I explained what was going on, she'd said to me that this is what we call derealization. And knowing now how rare it is for people to tell you specifically what this is, I went off that, and immediately I was like, okay, so this is normal, right? If she knows what this is normal. So that quite helped a lot. And she gave me some techniques, and I went home, and honestly, within 4 weeks, I was just living my life again. I actually forgot about it. I lived a decade, 10 years without any sort of anxiety symptoms. And it almost as if it was just a phase or I got a cold. But fast forward 10 years, that's where it really got out of hand. At this point, I'd had my first daughter. I'd started my second trade, so I was in the last sort of years of my capstone for becoming an electrician, which required like a lot of studying and, on top of working the other 4 days, pay wasn't great. So things were a little bit stressful, but I was moving forward in life. But yeah, then as hobbies, I was very into the gym. I'd say I lived a very caffeinated life, like a little sleep, coffees in the morning, coffees in the midday, and then a huge scoop of pre-workout in the afternoon. Um, I wouldn't say it was a healthy lifestyle, but yeah, I was very caffeinated. Um, so I was working a Saturday and it was just as normal. Didn't sleep much, had a coffee. And I thought I'll go to the gym. I'll finish this week off, with a good workout. Then I'll go home, carry on with what I do. The month leading to that day, I started having these weird, anxious, not attacks, but feelings. And it was always for some reason, specifically at night. And it was inconsistent too. It would happen maybe one night and then 3 nights later. But there was an uncomfortable, anxious feeling that I remember 10 years ago that was happening. And I didn't really think much of it. But that Saturday, I went to the gym. I had a long day, little sleep. I'd had a huge amount of pre-workout, way, way too much than what it was labeled to recommend as. And I got in, started my workout. About 10 minutes in is when I was looking in front of the gym mirrors where you can look at yourself, and that exact hyper-focus feeling of where my eye was on my mate, everything around me just felt like a void. Everything rushed in, rushed out, and it was just blurry. And my heart was beating out of my chest again. On top of taking that amount of pre-workout, with the lack of sleep probably didn't help. But I'd had by far the worst, most traumatizing panic attack of my life. And I remember relating it to what happened to me 10 years ago. And I ran for my car keys. I jumped in my ute. I drove straight home. I did the same thing. I called my mother again and I said, Mom, I'm having a panic attack. This one is outrageously aggressive. So I got home. My daughter was asleep at the time too. So I got home, ran upstairs. I tried to collect myself. I was on the phone to my mom. But this was just, I couldn't make sense of anything around me. But once that sort of finished, that visual disturbance stayed, but it stayed at such a aggressive scale. Almost felt like I was blind. Everything around me felt so unreal. It just did not make sense. I'd, been living in that world for 28 years at the time, and I couldn't make sense of anything around me. So that set me off. But luckily, I knew that there was a term for it that I learned from the psychologist. So I felt like this is derealization, but at a scale that I was not ready for. But in terms of how did it start for me? It started right there. That's where the journey really began.
Yeah. It's a tough experience. It really is. It's very common as well, Adam, to hear about people who've had it before when they were younger, and then it recurs later, maybe months or years after the first experience. But what can often happen is, and I'm sure you've seen this in some of the other interviews, but that people will have it as, when they're as teenagers, and it tends to be, or it can be quite a relatively brief experience. One of the factors involved in that is simply because teenagers tend to have a shorter attention span than adults. So it can be a little bit easier to focus away from it because there's so much other kind of drama happening in your life anyway.
Yeah.
And then as adults, we become more aware of our like internal processes and our mental health. So we can become maybe more prone to that kind of long form catastrophizing than we would have been when we were younger. That's so good to hear that you spoke to that therapist. Was this a psychiatrist, Adam? When you were
Just yeah, psychologist.
a psychologist, okay.
Psychologist. Yeah,
Yeah, who recognized DR and said this is because I can imagine that just even having a medical health professional calmly explain to you what this is must have taken so much of the weight off your shoulders.
I feel like it was a one in a million chance, just because like I've seen a lot of psychologists since, but the they just were like, it's what DPDR what, and I'm just like, okay. And then obviously I've seen a lot of interviews, and yeah, it's just not as recognized. But yeah, it was just an absolute blessing, and I feel fortunate for that. Definitely.
Isn't it so interesting? I mean, this you as a teenager, the first psychologist or medical professional you speak to knows what this is and explains it to you. And then the majority of the rest who you speak to don't know what it is. It's
Yeah.
yeah, it is changing. It is the awareness of it is definitely changing, but it's such a common experience. It was for me too. People just didn't, and especially when you're going through it first, that's petrifying. That's terrifying when you speak to a doctor. The doctor's like, I don't know what that is. Like, I don't know what the symptoms you're describing. Because that just confirms to you that you must be going crazy, or you've got something that nobody else has ever had. Um, the thing you mentioned as well, Adam, about you know getting up in the morning and hoping it would be gone. That's a very common experience. I had that too. Um, and the thing of checking the light switch or checking to see, okay, or even like pinching yourself and things like that. People will often say to me, am I dreaming? And the thing that I did as well was I was convinced that what was happening was directly connected to or correlated with my sleeping patterns, because I would have been fairly kind of caffeine intensive back in the day as well. Even though mine was initially triggered by a panic attack from weed, but I was drinking a lot of coffee, and I I still do, or I do again. But I responded to that feeling of dreaminess and sleepiness by drinking loads of coffee to try and wake myself up, to try and snap myself out of it, which, as you can imagine, at the start of having an anxiety-based condition, just made things worse and worse. But it was the only thing I could think to do at the time. It does sound like you had a good support system with your mother, and being able to just ring someone and have them, bring you to a safe environment and talk you down. Um, and the what you describe as well in terms of like that kind of hyper focus thing, it's such a common experience with not just DPDR but all anxiety based conditions, that it's like a tunnel vision. It's like you focus on what's happening in front of you, and it's like the what else is happening. The environment starts to kind of feel like it's blurry, or it's kind of like darkening. You're focusing only specifically on what's happening in front of you, and which can be useful if you're in a life or death situation, but not
Yeah.
when you're having a conversation, or looking in the mirror when you're about to go for your workout. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Adam, what were the days like that after? So you've had this second panic attack, massive panic attack, 10 years later. Um, you thought this was behind you. Now it's back. What are those subsequent days like after that?
But the first day was I wish I kept that psychologist number. Um, it's it'd been yeah. I mean, as a teen, I just like you say, I just didn't think much of it. I just thought, okay, this must be normal, because I was introduced to DPDR in such a casual manner and in respect. Um, I thought not much of it. So all the tips and tricks that I could have benefited from potentially, I'll never know, would have been handy now. Um, the following days from this, it was just so different. I just entered a world I just never saw myself being in. I've entered a place that even physically now like couldn't comprehend what I was feeling. Um, so the first night, I went straight onto the web because I was linking depersonalization, derealization, what I was told. That's the first place I went was Google, and the first place I found was a forum, and that was just an enhancement of making me feel a whole lot worse because some of the things I was reading just put the fear in me of just like, oh, this is not what I had. Then I started second guessing, is this derealization? Because I've got some guy telling me he's got it for 15 years. I'm on day one and I'm already struggling. Um, even the first night was an absolute struggle. I'm like I said, I had my daughter and my partner at the time who was, heavily pregnant. So how do I explain this to them? How do I, calmly try and explain this world of I feel like this, I feel like I'm going crazy, um, to them. And I obviously tried to explain to my partner, and she's always been supportive. And it's another blessing I've had is how understanding she was throughout the process. Um, but the first morning after that, it was like a deja vu. I had woken up. I had first thing my eyes open, and my mind magically, just snapped, just like that, snapped to, is it over? And that became a very unhealthy thought pattern throughout the entire process. But the first time of waking up, the visual disturbance was insane, and my anxiety levels were always, they're not at the attack level, but they were at the peak of wanting to attack. So fighting two elements at one, was just very difficult. I did the same thing as last time. My mother managed to find a psychologist on a Sunday. I don't know how, but she did. But immediately, the first thing we started trying to dig up was my past, and that's the last thing you want to dig up when you're in this world. All you want to do is find out what's wrong with you, why is this happening, and how do you stop it. And through time, I just couldn't find an answer. But yeah, the first week was real tough.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you still working in that in these in that first week, Adam?
I was I actually did go to work on the Monday. I just because of even though terrible I felt, I still to this day don't know how I went in, but I went in and I almost like I don't remember it. It's just I remember the Sunday was awful, and then the Monday I knew I had work, but I knew I had to go. It wasn't easy at all. I think at the time actually I had searched YouTube, and there were just some people that were talking about it, and there was I think it was sort of the midweek of that. I'd looked into the video, and this Australian girl from Perth, the other side of where I live from, she was talking about her sort of recovery journey, and she had a couple of episodes, and I was just sort of listening through with them and trying to understand what she was saying. But towards the end of her last video is when she actually mentioned the DP manual. So that's where I kind of got a grasp on, what to do and what not to do. But I'll get into that a bit later. But yeah, the first week of trying to work was hard. But at the time, I just didn't have a choice. I was so in depth with my course. It was so close to being finished. I was already earning, an apprenticeship wage, which was pretty daunting on the household. So I didn't really have much of a choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Adam, can you tell us some more about the symptoms you were experiencing in this time?
Yeah, the symptoms, I feel like I had like 90% of them. It just felt um the longer this happened, the more symptoms seemed to pop up. There's obvious starting ones were just anxious levels of wanting to have an anxiety attack. I had visual disturbances, which are pretty common at the starting phase. Um, I started through time getting muscle tension. Muscle tension was, my calves would feel insanely tight, my traps, my shoulders, my back. It just felt so tight all the time. Almost like, after an anxiety attack, when your blood's pumping, your quads feel really weak. It was like that, but sort of in random spots of my body. I had muscle twitching. My eyebrows would start twitching. My shoulder started twitching. Um, Neck pain. I had headaches. The list could go on. Um, Unfortunately, because of those symptoms, I adopted health anxiety as well, which was a completely separate struggle. It's um, yeah, the symptoms I felt like over time, when one would drop off, another would come up, and it became quite difficult to balance between DPDR and then thinking it's something else, which would then set off DPDR, and I'd have a headache, and first thing you type into Google is that you've got a tumor. If you have a sore neck, it's somehow related to something really bad when really you're just exceptionally stressed. But yeah, the symptoms, I had a lot of them.
um, the muscle tension and headaches and neck pain is so common with all anxiety-based conditions. And you're so right that, you know, experiencing those things on a normal day, you feel a sense of discomfort, but you'd be just like, oh, my next shoulder's a bit tight today, like, right? Stressed out, maybe drank too much
Mm.
coffee or whatever. But when you're going through an anxiety-based condition, I remember when I experienced like neck and shoulder tension, and it got bad quite quickly. But I was thinking like I'm after developing some sort of spinal condition. I was thinking I've got some sort of cancer or something like that. Just because it felt like it was impossible to explain how just kind of seized up my my neck and back became. Um, and when I recovered, I went back in it and I was like, well, sure, of course, that's what happened. Sure, I was stressed out. I was feeling very high levels of anxiety. Where does that manifest? It manifests in your muscles and like tension and twitching and spasming and. But when you're going through it, it's like you lose that perspective and you just are jumping to the worst possible conclusion in for each one of these symptoms, on top of the feeling of disconnection from the world around you that's happening as well. It's just this perfect storm of symptoms.
It's an endless loophole too, because I saw so many different doctors. I would see one, not believe him, see another. And I found a really good guy that was local to us, and I thought he'll tell me the truth. And he just says, "You've got anxiety." And we we got MRI. We got I went to back specialists, neck specialists. I even got my eyes checked. And even though that result was in my hand on paper, I got blood tests. I think I got like 4 blood tests in 6 months just because I thought something wrong with the machine. I thought my blood got mixed up with someone else's. I said, there's no way I feel like this because of anxiety. That's not possible. Um, it became crazy. I look back at it, I laugh. At the time, I was petrified, but I look now, and it's just like it got out of hand. But um, it can send you crazy in itself when you can't find an explanation for physical feelings, physical reactions in your body that you can't explain.
Yeah, totally. When you go for like MRIs and you get all these specialists and get your vision checked and nobody can find anything wrong, there's almost a sense of disappointment because you're like, well, if that's not it, what the hell is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I went. I mean, I went to an optometrist and I was like, we have to get to the bottom of this today,
Yeah.
right? Because my vision was all over the place, or felt like it was, and there was floaters, tracers, visual snow, blurriness, and I went in and he's going to print out this like rap sheet of things that are wrong with my vision, and this is going to be the start of my journey towards fixing my eyes.
Yeah.
And like it's glaucoma, it had, nah, there was nothing wrong. My prescription hadn't even changed. There was nothing
Mm.
wrong with my eyes. And I remember walking out the optometrist going like, damn it, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
because now I'm back to now I'm back to having no clue what the hell is wrong with me. And if someone had said to me like it's something in your blood, like I'd be like, is it? Okay, well let's give that a go, but everyone I went to said there's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah.
And then as you said, Adam, the people, the therapists of the doctors who said to me, this is anxiety. I was just like, this isn't anxiety. Like anxiety doesn't make me not recognize myself in the mirror. Like anxiety doesn't make me feel like I'm not here. That's not anxiety. Um, the thing is that it is anxiety. It's just a different level of anxiety to our frame of reference. But that is so rarely explained in those settings that when someone says it's anxiety, it feels like it's just kind of an excuse to get rid of you. But it's true. It's actually correct. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's not, it doesn't have the specificity that you need to actually calm yourself down, which you thankfully had when you were 17, but weren't able to find again when you got it 10 years later, it seems.
Yeah. It's I feel for everyone that, we go through it and we build the courage in itself just to leave the house, to make the first step of something's wrong with me. And even if I remember the twitching was a really bad one for me because at that point my health anxiety was quite bad. And anything on Google, see twitching is some sort of MS, something like that.
Yeah.
And but yeah, you build the courage up, and I almost came to terms that this is what I'm going to get the result for. But then I was given, a result of you're completely fine. But even though I was happy that I was completely fine, I was disappointed to not know what's still going on.
Yeah. It's interesting, about a month and a half ago, I got a twitch in my left eye, and uh, I noticed this, and it was kind of getting kind of more intense. And I said to myself, okay, this is probably because I spend a lot of time looking at screens, where I work with computers primarily. Also, I drink a lot of coffee, and you know that's probably what it is. So I looked up what to do, and it was like magnesium. Take some magnesium, and also, your eyelid twitching I think the eyelid is one of the, I think it's one of the smallest, if not the smallest, muscle in the body. So it's one of the first to start twitching or spasming if there is a buildup of stress or just too much screen time or whatever. So I reduced my screen time. I started drinking a bit more tea instead of coffee, took magnesium, and it stopped, right?
Yeah.
Grand. Now, if that had happened to me back in 2005, I would have been on the warpath, like to get to the nearest multiple sclerosis specialist
Yeah.
to find, because that has to be it. There's no other explanation, right? Um, it's like if you have the context of not looking at it, one of the things I say in the DP manual is like one of the most frustrating things about anxiety is that it causes us to look at the symptoms of anxiety through the filter of anxiety. So we look at something like a twitching eyelid and we jump to the worst possible conclusion. Whereas when you look at it from a non-anxious perspective, it's like your eyelid is twitching. I mean, this is extremely common. Why don't you reduce your coffee intake and and reduce your screen time instead of jumping to the conclusion that you've got some horrendous condition that you can't get rid of, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Adam, can you talk us through the next couple of months with this? Like, what was the did you, because I remember for me, I remember thinking like, okay, this is a very difficult experience, but like there's an answer. Like there has to be an answer here somewhere. And I remember like a couple of months in where I realized like, okay, this doesn't seem to be going away and nobody seems to be able to help me out. And that really terrified me. I was thinking like, oh, Christ, this could be long term. And then as you mentioned as well, seeing on the forums people who say, oh, I've had this 15 years.
Yeah. So, like I was saying, there was a girl sort of on the other side of the country to me who had made these videos. Um, so sort of like a week after that initial panic attack, that's when I discovered the DP manual. Yeah, no, she'd mentioned, the manual, and I thought, oh, okay, cool. Like this is the first anchor point to it all. This is where I'm gonna go. So I looked into it, and then there were YouTube videos, and you could see that there was a plan, and at that point that week, I just was like, I'll take anything. I could take my daughter's advice, and I'd take it as a chance. So I looked into it, and yeah, I think it was a long weekend at the time, so I actually had a couple of days off. So I think it was about 4 days off, and everything kind of landed really well in place. So I'd got the manual, and the fact that it was audio as well was perfect for me. I'm not big on reading, and I just knew even if I tried to read with what was going on, it just wouldn't have happened. So, the audio was fantastic. So I'd gone through, I purchased it, I'd binged about 8 of the segments that first night, and automatically, there was a plan, like I said. And it was up to me to obviously put that plan into space, into place. And I had listened through and sort of hearing an accurate description of someone's experience was a nice turning point for how I was feeling, but in more of a detailed way. So I, yeah, listened to that and started progressing through, and then really taking on board some of the notes. And luckily, one of them was especially, don't stop doing what you're meant to do. So I thought, oh, awesome. Well, I went to work as much as I really didn't want to. I'd still gone to work, but it was short lived. I would work my way through the book, and I think it's when I got near sort of the mid, maybe the late section. It was understanding that this is not an up graph. There is going to be setbacks and setbacks, and I think that was the part I couldn't comprehend, trying to work my way past this feeling. Accepting that there were setbacks meant that I was doing good, and that was sort of yeah, essentially just trying to put things in place and commit to them. But yeah, the first 3 months, it was no easy task. I made the mistake of going on forums, and then I probably also made the mistake of looking at recovery stories that had maybe an unrealistic time frame, which, for me, hearing 15 years was petrifying, but then hearing 2 weeks would be like, okay, that's cool. But if I didn't meet that 2 weeks, it was like I was at square one again.
Yeah. um it's the whole kind of time frame thing is interesting because when we see that, like, okay, some person had it for maybe 15 years and maybe then they recovered, and you see another person who had it for 2 weeks and they recovered, and what that shows, all that shows is that people get anxiety-based conditions and recover from them, and it takes people different amounts of time to find the correct information and do the right things to recover. That's all. That's all that shows you. But what it makes us feel like is that Well, there's a type of DPDR that lasts for 15 years. There's a type of DPDR that lasts for 2 weeks. I don't know what type I have. And if I can't recover in 2 weeks, that might mean that I have the type that lasts for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years.
Yeah.
But again, all that we're doing when we do that is we are giving strength to the idea that it deserves our attention at all. Because what we're aiming for with recovery is not to kind of like hit some time limit or to say, oh, I got rid of it in 2 weeks or I got rid of it in 2 months. Like, what we're aiming for is to get to a place where this has nothing to do with you anymore. You know, it's a good example again is like think of having imagine someone having a song stuck in their head, and someone says, well, I had a song stuck in my head for 2 hours. Another person said, I had a song stuck in my head for 2 weeks. And you say, Jesus, I hope I don't have it stuck in my head for 2 weeks. I hope I can get rid of it in 2 hours. But you're already thinking of it in the way that you shouldn't be or that you don't need to do. Why would you put a timeline on something that you're aiming to have nothing to do with anymore? So while in recovery, we say, okay, we don't even give it that. Don't put a timeline on it. Don't give it anything positively or negatively, and we focus away from it. But it is, of course, it feels like it makes sense to apply other people's recovery timelines onto ourselves. But part of recovery is understanding that, like, that putting a timer on a habit of thought is just inadvertently focusing back on the thought itself, and we train ourselves away from that. And the thing is, well, you mentioned, Adam, about the setbacks versus the smooth curve, because what we want initially is, like, we want recovery to just be like this really smooth kind of curve downwards. And like any habit of thought, it's never that. Like, it's unfair to expect that of yourself. It's the stock market. Well, actually, maybe not the stock market at the moment. Yeah, in April of 2025, that's probably not the best example.
No.
it's more like a mountain range. It's ups and downs. But the thing is that when we start to see progress and we have those little spikes, we panic and we think, oh, this means that I'm back to square one or whatever. But no, that's not what it is. This is a natural, normal part of the recovery process. Those little speed bumps are meant to be there. But when we can anticipate them and expect them, that takes the edge off them and allows us to move past them and put them behind us. And I might be jumping back a little bit, Adam, but a question I just always like to ask everybody is, what was your lowest point in the whole experience? Is there a particular time or incident that stays with you?
Yeah, this one I can pinpoint every day of the week. At the same time, this is also what flipped me into my highest point. My lowest, yeah, I had gone through, like we were just talking the graph, I was having some ups, a couple of downs, ups. I'd put everything into practice. Things were starting to get better. I was having breaks, but I had a really bad setback. And I remember I was sitting with my daughter, putting it into bed, and I remember just looking at her, and I just, the day before I'd had one of those setbacks, and they kind of linger for a few days for me anyway. I just wasn't feeling great. I just felt like there was no end to this. And I just remember looking at her and I just felt terrible. And she was too young to know what was going on. At the time, my partner was heavily pregnant, and, she really picked up the pieces in also trying to understand what was going on. And, growing up, I always had this vision of what father I would be, not growing up with one. And I had all these expectations and plans. And, it's why I wanted to have an image of someone she can trust. And then all these extra essential thoughts were running through my mind of, that's not going to happen. How can you be that? You can't even leave the house. You can't even look after your kids. You can't even be there for your pregnant wife. And all these thoughts started coming through. And some of them at the time were true, because I was so incapable of doing some things Um, yeah, I couldn't be a father at the level that I expected myself to be, no matter how hard I tried. And yeah, I shed a few tears that night, probably a lot, if I'm being honest. It was a lot for me just to see her and expect another one, you know, a month or two away. And that really sent me into just hopelessness. That now I need to start planning of how can I just make it by the day? How can I, you know, make this work in 20 years' time? Because this is life now. And that's what I truly believed. So I sat with that for a few days, and it was awful. But at the same time, that was also my biggest motivation. I thought I I'm to be relied on. I'm to be trusted. I'm to be a father, and I owe it to them because I didn't ask them to be here. You know, I brought them in. We brought them into the world, and I owe them everything. And I said I need to live up to that, so I can. It's a two-way choice. I can lay here in despair every day and make no progression, or I can at least try every day because I have nothing to lose at this point. I felt if this is as bad as it gets, this is as bad as it gets. So there's no harm in just restarting. Let's try again. So yeah, my lowest was dark. It was, I'll never forget it. I remember never forget me just realizing how bad this is. But it was also my highest, which was my biggest motivation to click it into the next gear.
It's something people often describe as well as a sense of kind of a sense of grief for the life that you had. I certainly felt that. I felt a deep sense of sadness that like the kind of dreams and goals that I had were just dashed kind of overnight. And I can only imagine how much more acute that must have felt when, you have a kid that you are, entirely responsible for and another one on the way. And yeah, but that it seems did provide you with the motivation to start moving forward. And with that in mind, so Adam, what did the recovery process feel like when it started to happen? When did you start to see the positive changes? How did they manifest?
I I actually just realistically I listened to the manual again. There's actually a lot I missed because I was so frantic at the time. Just hearing this, and this the process. I really thought, no, okay, I'm gonna listen to this one more time, and I'm gonna take some real key points and really put them into practice. And the biggest part is distraction for me. Distraction was the key for me. Um, I had the biggest motivation with no excuses. I thought I can make this work. So in saying, yeah, I went out and slowly made ships at just doing things that I love. Motorbikes is huge for me. Um, I've got a lot of high school friends that I ride with, and that I had not been doing. So in saying all this, I was very absent from friends, and some were very understanding, some wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But my first step is to be selfless for them. I need to be selfish for me. I need to go and take some time to do things that I remember I love, no matter how scared I was. And the first step for me was getting back into my motorbikes, going to the racetrack, because that's what I lived before children, before any of these massive events in my life. So that I crawled back into. I got my best friend who knew what was going on, and he said, "No, I've got you through this. Like, let's just try. Let's just try go out for a day, half a day, and if you're not feeling it, we'll come home." Um, and riding that motorbike again was a milestone of me going, that was the first time hadn't felt it for almost a day. Being so focused while riding, like it requires your entire mental capacity. You're trying to, brake, you're going extremely fast. And I remember getting back into the pits and at the track, and I pulled in and I was like, that was unreal. I felt nothing bad. That was a rush. So we went out again and again. And by the end of the day, I was exhausted, but it was a good day. And I took a lot of positives from that. Um, the second thing for me is I thought I'm going to take up a very interaction type hobby. So I actually picked up photography. Um, I went to a lot of bike meets around Sydney. The bike scene here is quite big. So, there's big meets where lots of people are, not where anxiety people like to be, but that's where I picked it up. So I picked it up, I thought I might take some photos and then it got to, what camera do you buy? I spent hours on YouTube figuring out what cameras were good, what lenses were good, what's compatible with what. And in the midst of this, I was so distracted and excited. I just hadn't thought about it. And I applied that and went out to some meets, took some photos of people's bikes, and people would come up to me and go, where do I see these photos? And that's where I was like, I'll start an Instagram page. And then I made an Instagram page and, all my focus was into doing this and other people were really happy with it. And I just found myself more and more distracted. For me, that was my power play to really stick with this. The distractions is what's working. Of course, it wasn't, an uphill graph. I still had some setbacks. I'd finished the day, I'd come home. Night was probably my worst in terms of timings of the day. Trying to sleep has never been something I'm good at. But that was where I was like, okay, this is what's working. Distractions, distractions, distractions. So I just had to fine suit that at night now because I knew what I could do throughout the day. Which was just mainly just filling my time in with YouTube videos. If I felt off, if I felt something coming on, if my vision was disturbed, I just got to think to the practices of the manual. It's like the more I pay attention to this, the more I'm telling my whole being that this is bad. So yeah, learning to be uncomfortable is very difficult and it's easier said than done. I know that. But the longer you try to practice it and when it starts happening, not to panic to find a distraction, but to just know that, okay, I'm uncomfortable. That was the hardest part for me as well. Like really trying to be comfortable. And it took practice, but by the end of it, yeah, I'd found little chinks in each section to have a solution for everything, but not act like it's the end of the world when something starts happening. And these patterns and time frames of breaks became longer and longer until I almost, just forgot about it.
It feels so strange when we do things like that because we think it's going to be just completely overwhelming and terrifying. And not that you don't feel anxiety when you do these things, but when something takes your focus and your attention, it just drags the spotlight of your attention away from anxiety onto something else long enough to demonstrate to your brain that you don't need it. And those moments can be quite brief at first, but then they get bigger and longer and going to bike meets and stuff as well. That's the thing, is like I remember for me, like going to the gym was a big thing because I've thought like there's bright lights, there's people around, people are chatting, people, talk to each other. There's music. I have to travel there and back, but then you do it. And again, not that you don't feel anxiety, but you come back and you're like, I did it. And I didn't die. I didn't like faint. I didn't collapse on the treadmill, I'm okay.
Yeah.
And also I love the thing about getting into photography as well. What a beautiful way to focus your attention again. when you're taking pictures, you are like completely in the zone, and you're, checking the settings on the camera, and you're like composing, and you're uh and also with photography, like there's a big social aspect to it as well. I mean, if you're taking portraits of people, you got to talk to them. You have to. I did this a lot with I really got back into photography big time in the last couple of years as well. Um, but it's doing these things that feel like, I mean, and I'm sure that like when there was a time for you, Adam, when like if someone said to you, you'll be on your motorbike, you'll be going to bike meets, and you'll be doing photography, that they may as well have said to you like you'll be going on a rocket to Mars, like, it just wouldn't have made
It's
sense.
no, and I look back at it and I just remember it's that mentality of just what this does to us. It just really wants you to believe that you're not. Yeah, you can think these things are going to happen, but to you, it's going to make you feel like it's an unreality, it's unrealistic, and you know, I can't explain it. I never thought. I laugh at it because it was such a milestone. Um, but yeah, yeah, as you said, it's a huge moment.
Yeah. Someone said to me on a recovery interview a couple of months back that he thought that recovery was going to be this big Hollywood moment, that like he'd wake up and there'd be just like the birds singing and DPDR is completely gone, and he'd go to work and he'd hop up on the desk and start belting out songs, and there'd be a dance number. And he said the recovery was just boring, but in the best possible way. You just get completely back to normal, and all the fears are just gone, and your day just gets back to, taking your car to the mechanic, taking your dog for a walk, and yeah, yeah. Was this something similar for you, Adam? Was there a day where you kind of realized, oh, it's gone, or was it just something in the background?
It's bizarre. I remember telling myself, like, when I was having those highs, I would I was a big supporter of the channel, and I said, I'm gonna be on one of those videos, and when the day I recover, I'm gonna have everyone over, and we're gonna go out and do what we used to do, and I just that day never happened because it just molds in so unnoticeably. When you're doing what you're meant to be doing, it just smooths itself back into reality. And there are moments like where I think about it briefly, and I will smile, um, and go, I forgot I'm recovered. Like, like, yeah, it's a strange feeling because I was so envy of just getting to that day. You think there's a day on the calendar, you just don't know when it is, and you're gonna have this big celebration. I really thought I was, but yeah, it never came, never happened.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good way of putting it. You just kind of, it just molds itself back in. It just kind of, it's just there, and you you forget to be concerned about it. You forget to be worried about it. But you forget even to forget. Like, it's all because you're just doing other stuff now. Now it's just like, well,
Yeah.
back to working. I've got 100 things to do. Like, and why would I? The example I always like to give is like, would you like DPDR is a symptom of anxiety. Muscle tension in your shoulder is a symptom of anxiety. When you recover from muscle tension, do you go and celebrate? Like, do you walk around like saying to yourself, like, thank God that muscle tension is gone.
Mm.
Thank God my shoulder's back to normal. No, because you're going to the cinema, or you're going to the bike meet, or you're picking your kids up from school, or you're doing 100 other things. It's
Yeah.
it's a thing that happened. It wasn't pleasant, but you know now that it was never going to hurt you. It was never going to turn into anything worse, and it's gone. And you've got better things to do with your time now than focus on it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, Adam, how was the DP manual helpful in your recovery?
The DP manual is, like I said, touching back what I said, it's phenomenal. The audio side of it was just great because for me, it was like a pocket companion. You know, if it's on my phone. If I have a moment, I really need a bit of assistance. There's sections, and the sections I struggled with, and just sometimes, when we're so frantic and we kind of lose ourselves, even though we're putting things in place and we're doing the right thing, we can lose ourselves, and sometimes we just need a bit of a reminder. So for me, having that companion in my phone, I could just pop my headphones in and it would just steer me correct and remind me, this is why this is happening. This is why this is happening. Don't do this. And yeah, it like I said, when I was really in a bit of trouble at the start and lost, it just put everything in more perspective. It gave me a path, like I think I said before, it just gave me a path to follow, and reassurance. I think that was very important, reassurance that it may feel different. You may feel like you're that one guy that's girl that's going to get that 15 years of that. It's just like, listen to my story and then come have a look at all the other stories. You're not alone. And I think the hardest part is convincing yourself you will be okay. But yeah, I can't tell you how. I promise you, you will be okay. It's the manual is very reassuring, and yeah, like I said, the audiobook just being audio for me, even some nights when I just couldn't sleep and I don't want to look at a screen, you can just pop it on and just go through some, reminders, some drills, and yeah, very, very helpful for me.
That's great. I'm so glad to hear it. Adam, a question that people always ask me, and a question I'm sure you've seen on the channel before, is this. Now that you've recovered from DPDR, is getting back to normal really getting back to normal?
Like I'm back to normal, and they're words I never thought I'd say. I'm back to normal, but it's better because we all uniquely embark through this traumatizing experience, this very lonely experience. And when we're so deep in it, that's the last thing we think is that there's an end. Because it's so, like I said, it's so convincing at telling you that this will last forever. But knowing that I've gone through that now kind of makes me happy. Would I go through it again? Probably not. um, the experience definitely showed the mental strength that we're capable of as humans, and how much you learn about yourself and the human body. Anxiety is a very normal but very interesting phenomenon we have. And I learned a lot. I feel like I'm an expert with anxiety. I feel like I could get a degree tomorrow to tell people what's going on. It's yeah, our body is a very interesting thing. But yeah, normal is normal now. I live my life as I did, just knowing that I'd been through a little bit of something and I'm at the end of it, and I'm quite happily doing the very best I've always wanted to do, which was for my kids. And that was the most accomplishing part of it.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. Adam, one more question before we finish up. There's going to be people watching this interview who may be going through something very, very similar to what you went through. If you could have a chat with yourself back when you were 17 years old, or even back in 2022 when it came back, what would you say to yourself?
I would say definitely, for one, you are not alone. Um, as hard as it is to believe, as hard as what you're feeling right now, is there an end? I promise you there is an end. I promise you, as strange as this is normal. What you're experiencing is naturally normal and a response. And my biggest advice is to find the distractions, because that was the biggest turning point. Understand what's going on with you, but don't research so deep that it does you damage. Like I said, we struggle to separate anxiety with DPDR, thinking DPDR is the tree and the strand is anxiety, whereas it's reversed. This is anxiety. It's just a strange and temporary version of it that we really struggle to understand at really hard times. But I I look back literally where I was, where everyone may be right now, and listening to someone else tell me that it will be okay, and me going, I just don't see how. But the human body just there's no words. I promise you, it will be okay. It's you've just got to find the right pattern in things to do, and you know, find lifestyle changes that will benefit you. But the worst thing you can do is not do anything at all. I promise you.
Um, Adam, it's been so great to chat with you today, man. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for being with us on the channel and for sharing your experiences. I know there's going to be people watching the interview today who are going to find your story so helpful and inspirational. Um, yeah, and again, for anyone watching us, check out Adam's photography on his Instagram page, which we'll link to in the video description. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, Adam. Thank you so much for being with us today.
No, thank you very much for having me.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.